In a quiet little town, there was a karate dojo tucked away at the end of a busy street. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple space with wooden floors, faded posters of martial arts moves on the walls, and a faint smell of sweat mixed with cleaning products. But for many people in the area, it was a place where they could push themselves, learn something new, and feel stronger, not just physically but mentally too. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dojo buzzed with energy. Students of all ages were scattered around, practicing kicks, punches, and blocks under the watchful eyes of their instructors. Among them was a woman who had recently joined the class. She wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but she carried herself with a quiet determination that made her stand out. This was her third week at the dojo, and though she still felt like a beginner, she came every day ready to give her best effort. She didn't come here because she wanted to win trophies or impress anyone. Her reasons were much simpler and much deeper. Growing up, she'd always been the type of person who avoided conflict. Whether it was dealing with rude coworkers or ignoring catcalls on the street, she often found herself wishing she knew how to handle situations where she felt powerless. So, when a friend suggested she try martial arts, she decided to take the leap. Every punch she threw, every stance she held, felt like a step toward reclaiming control over her life. But not everyone in the class shared her thoughtful approach. One of the instructors, a man in his mid-30s with a black belt tied proudly around his waist, had a reputation for being flashy and full of himself. He loved showing off complicated techniques that left students in awe, and he often cracked jokes during lessons, even if they weren't always kind. To him, teaching seemed less about helping others grow and more about proving how superior he was. That night, as the session wound down and students began pairing off for sparring practice, the instructor strolled through the room, observing. His gaze landed on the new woman, watching as she practiced a basic block with a partner. She moved slowly, focusing intently on getting each movement right. A smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. "You're holding back," he announced loudly, stopping in front of her. Everyone nearby turned to look. "Come on, let's see what you're really capable of." The woman hesitated, unsure what to say. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, wrapping one arm around her neck in a playful but firm chokehold. "Let's have some fun," he chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. Some students laughed nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether this was part of the lesson or just another example of his antics. For the woman, though, it wasn't funny. As his grip tightened slightly, memories flooded back moments when she'd felt small, helpless, and unable to defend herself. For years, she'd carried those feelings with her, and now, here she was, literally being held down by someone who thought it was all just a game. Her heart pounded in her chest, but instead of panicking, something inside her clicked. All those hours of practice, all the time she'd fallen and gotten back up, all the frustration and hard work, it all came rushing back. In that instant, she realized she wasn't the same person she used to be. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let anyone treat her like a prop for their amusement. Without saying a word, she took a deep breath and focused. Slowly, deliberately, she dropped her weight, throwing him off balance. Then, using everything she'd learned in class, she twisted out of his hold and spun around, locking him into a perfect armbar, a move they'd practiced earlier that week. The room went dead silent. No one expected this outcome, not the other students, and certainly not the instructor. As pain shot through his shoulder, his confident grin vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. What happened next would leave everyone talking for weeks to come. The moment the woman locked the instructor into the armbar, time seemed to freeze in the dojo. The other students stopped what they were doing, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. Some looked on with wide-eyed disbelief, while others leaned forward, curious to see how it would play out. No one said a word. The only sounds were the soft creak of the wooden floor underfoot and the faint rustle of uniforms as people shifted uncomfortably. The instructor, caught completely off guard, struggled to break free. He tried twisting his body, shifting his weight, and even attempting to grab at her arms, but nothing worked. Her technique was solid textbook perfect, in fact. It was almost poetic, considering he had drilled this very move into his students countless times before. Now he was the one on the receiving end, and it was clear he hadn't expected her to execute it so flawlessly. For the woman, this wasn't just about defending herself anymore. As she held him firmly in place, she felt a surge of emotions bubbling up inside her. Anger, yes, but also pride, determination, and something else she couldn't quite put into words. For years, she'd let people push her around, whether it was rude comments from strangers or dismissive behavior at work. She'd always told herself it wasn't worth making a fuss over, that speaking up would only make things worse. But now, standing here with the instructor trapped in her grip, she realized how wrong she'd been. "You think this is fun?" she asked, her voice low but steady. There was no yelling, no dramatic flair, just calm authority. "You think grabbing someone without their consent is okay because you're the teacher? Let me tell you something, it's not." Her words hit hard, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. The instructor winced, partly from the pain in his shoulder, but mostly from the weight of her statement. He opened his mouth to respond, probably to brush it off or try to regain control of the situation. But she didn't give him the chance. "This is how it feels," she continued, leaning in slightly. "This is what it's like when someone uses their strength to intimidate you. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before putting your hands on someone for fun." Her tone wasn't aggressive, but there was an edge to it that made everyone take notice. Even the students who hadn't been paying attention earlier were now fully invested in what was happening. Some nodded silently in agreement, while others exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to say or do. The instructor, meanwhile, was starting to panic. Despite his years of training and experience, he couldn't break free from her hold. His face turned red, not just from the physical strain, but from embarrassment, too. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the expert, the one in charge, the person everyone looked up to. And yet here he was, literally at the mercy of a beginner. Okay. He finally blurted out, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry. Just let me go." His apology came out rushed and awkward, lacking the confidence he usually carried. It was clear he wasn't used to being in this position, and it showed. Still, the woman didn't release him right away. She wanted to make sure her message sank in. After a few more seconds, she eased up just enough for him to pull away, clutching his arm and taking a step back. As soon as he was free, he stumbled backward, his face flushed and his breathing heavy. For a moment, he stood there, looking around at the silent crowd of students watching him. Then, without another word, he muttered something under his breath and hurried toward the corner of the room, trying to compose himself. The rest of the class remained eerily quiet. Some students glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. Others stared at the woman, their expressions a mix of admiration and surprise. One young girl near the front whispered to her friend, "Did you see that?" She totally owned him. Her friend nodded, wide-eyed, clearly impressed. For the woman, the aftermath of the encounter was a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her felt guilty for embarrassing the instructor in front of everyone, especially since she knew he was still technically her teacher. But another part of her felt proud, not because she'd humiliated him, but because she'd stood up for herself in a way she never thought she could. She realized that martial arts wasn't just about learning techniques or building strength. It was about finding your voice and using it when it mattered most. As the class slowly began to return to normal, the instructor avoided making eye contact with anyone. He busied himself adjusting equipment and pretending to focus on paperwork. But it was obvious he was shaken. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the center of attention, and he didn't like it one bit. Meanwhile, the woman quietly returned to her spot on the mat, trying to process everything that had just happened. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares on her, but instead of shrinking away like she might have done in the past, she held her head high. She knew this moment would stay with her forever, not because of what she'd done, but because of how it made her feel, strong, capable, and unstoppable. And as the final minutes of class ticked away, one thing became crystal clear. Things in the dojo would never be the same again. The ripple effects of that dramatic day in the dojo continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. What started as a single moment, a woman standing her ground against an overconfident instructor, slowly began to reshape not just the dynamics of the class, but also the mindset of its members. People who had once been silent observers were now starting to speak up, and those who felt powerless found courage in the example set before them. For the instructor, life after the incident was a lesson in humility he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. At first, he tried to downplay it, brushing off any questions or comments with vague answers like, "It happens to everyone," or "She caught me off guard, that's all." But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about losing control during a sparring session. It was about something bigger: his attitude, his approach to teaching, and how he treated others. He couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. Students talked among themselves about how uncomfortable they sometimes felt when he singled them out during practice. A few even admitted they avoided coming to certain classes because they didn't want to be put on the spot. These revelations hit him hard. He had always seen himself as a mentor, someone who pushed people to their limits so they could grow. But now, he realized that pushing too hard or without consideration could do more harm than good. So, slowly and quietly, he began to change. During sparring sessions, he stopped targeting beginners for tests and instead focused on guiding them through techniques at their own pace. When students struggled with a move, he took the time to break it down step by step, encouraging them rather than teasing them. And perhaps most importantly, he started listening not just to their questions, but to their concerns. If someone said they weren't comfortable doing something, he respected that. It was a small shift, but it made a world of difference. Not everyone noticed these changes right away. Some students still held on to lingering resentment toward him, especially those who had witnessed years of arrogance and dismissive behavior. But over time, even the skeptics began to see glimpses of a different man, one who seemed genuinely interested in helping them improve, rather than proving his dominance. As for the woman at the center of it all, she remained humble despite the growing admiration from her peers. She never sought recognition or praise, but it came anyway in the form of nods of respect, quiet words of gratitude, and even invitations to train with senior students who wanted to learn from her calm yet assertive demeanor. Her confidence grew steadily, not because she craved attention, but because she had discovered something invaluable within herself: resilience. One evening, after a particularly intense practice session, a young girl approached her shyly. The girl was new to the dojo, barely 12 years old, and looked nervous as she tugged at the hem of her uniform. "Excuse me," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I heard what you did to the instructor." The woman smiled gently, kneeling down to meet the girl's eye level. "What did you hear?" she asked, curious about how the story had been retold. "That you stood up to him," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "and that you didn't let him scare you." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "That's true," she said, "but it wasn't about being brave or strong. It was about knowing my worth and knowing that no one has the right to treat me badly, no matter who they are. The girl hesitated, then blurted out, "Do you think I can do that too? Stand up for myself?" Without missing a beat, the woman placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "Of course you can," she said firmly. "You're stronger than you think. And remember, standing up for yourself doesn't mean fighting back every time. Sometimes it's just about saying no or walking away when something doesn't feel right." The girl's face lit up with relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For weeks afterward, she trained with renewed energy, often glancing at the woman for guidance. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had joined the dojo in the first place, not just to protect herself, but to inspire others to find their own strength. Meanwhile, the culture of the dojo continued to evolve. Conversations that once revolved solely around techniques and belt rankings now included discussions about boundaries, mutual respect, and self-worth. Senior students began mentoring newcomers, creating a supportive environment where everyone felt valued. Even the younger kids, who used to giggle nervously whenever the instructor raised his voice, started speaking up when something made them uncomfortable. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always smooth. There were still moments of tension, especially between the instructor and some of the more skeptical students. But overall, the atmosphere became lighter, friendlier, and more inclusive. The dojo was no longer just a place to learn martial arts. It had become a community where people felt safe to grow, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. For the woman, seeing this change unfold was deeply rewarding. She hadn't set out to revolutionize the class or challenge authority. All she had wanted was to defend herself and remind others that respect is non-negotiable. Yet somehow, her actions had sparked a chain reaction that touched everyone involved. Looking back, she realized that standing up to the instructor wasn't the end of her journey, it was only the beginning. Martial arts had given her tools she never imagined she'd need: patience, discipline, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. But more than anything, it had taught her that true strength comes not from overpowering others, but from empowering yourself and sometimes empowering those around you. And while she knew there would always be challenges ahead, both inside and outside the dojo, she faced them with a quiet confidence that inspired everyone who crossed her path. After all, the real fight wasn't against other people. It was against the doubts, fears, and insecurities that held her back. And in that battle, she was winning, one step at a time. By the time the class ended, word about what had happened was already spreading like wildfire. As students filed out of the dojo, they couldn't help but talk among themselves in hushed tones. Some were buzzing with excitement, replaying the moment when the woman took down the instructor. Others were more reserved, whispering about whether it was appropriate to humiliate him like that. Either way, everyone had an opinion, and by the next day, the story had reached nearly every corner of the martial arts community in town. The instructor, for his part, tried to act like nothing unusual had happened. He showed up to the following class wearing his usual confident demeanor, cracking jokes and demonstrating flashy techniques as if he hadn't been caught off guard just 24 hours earlier. But there was something different about him, something subtle yet noticeable. His laughter seemed a little forced, his movements a bit stiffer than usual. And whenever he passed by the woman who had bested him, he avoided eye contact altogether. Still, he wasn't ready to admit defeat, not publicly, at least. When a few senior students cautiously brought up the incident later that week, asking if everything was okay, he brushed them off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It was nothing," he said, trying to sound casual. "She got lucky, that's all." But deep down, he knew better. For years, he'd prided himself on being the top dog in the dojo. He loved the admiration of his students, the feeling of being untouchable. Now, for the first time, he'd been reminded that he wasn't invincible. Worse still, he'd been humbled not by another black belt or a seasoned fighter, but by someone who was still learning the basics. The thought gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night and making him question everything from his teaching methods to his own ego. For the woman, life after the incident was a mixed bag. On one hand, she felt a newfound sense of confidence that radiated through every aspect of her life. At work, she found herself speaking up during meetings where she used to stay silent. On the street, she walked taller, holding her head high. Instead of avoiding eye contact, even her posture improved. She no longer slouched as if carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Martial arts had given her more than just physical skills. It had taught her how to carry herself with dignity and purpose, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. Not everyone was happy about what had happened. A handful of students loyal to the instructors started giving her sideways glances during practice, muttering under their breath whenever she walked by. One even went so far as to accuse her of showing off and making trouble. These comments stung, especially coming from people she'd considered teammates. Still, she refused to let them get to her. Every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself why she'd joined the class in the first place: to become stronger, both inside and out. What surprised her most, though, was the support she received from others. After the initial shock wore off, several students approached her to express their admiration. One older man, a brown belt who rarely spoke during class, pulled her aside after practice one evening. "I've been training here for years," he said, his voice low but sincere, "and I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that. You did good." Another student, a young mother who often brought her son to class, thanked her for setting an example. "My boy looks up to you now," she said with a smile. "He told me last night that he wants to be brave like you someday." These moments made all the negativity worth it. They reminded her that standing up for yourself isn't just about personal growth, it's about inspiring others to do the same. Every time someone praised her courage, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about showing others that they too could find strength in unexpected places. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the dojo began to shift. The instructor, perhaps realizing his behavior had crossed a line, started making small changes. During sparring sessions, he became less aggressive, taking care not to overpower beginners. He also began explaining techniques more thoroughly, encouraging questions instead of brushing them off. It wasn't a complete transformation. He still had moments of arrogance, but it was progress, and the students noticed. For the woman, these changes were proof that sometimes standing your ground can spark meaningful growth, not just for yourself, but for those around you. She continued attending classes, pushing herself harder with each passing week. Her goal wasn't to prove anything to anyone anymore. Instead, she trained because she loved it, for the discipline, the camaraderie, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was becoming the best version of herself. And while she never sought recognition or praise, she couldn't deny the impact her actions had on the dojo. Conversations that once revolved solely around kicks and punches now included discussions about respect, boundaries, and empowerment. Slowly but surely, the culture of the class began to evolve, thanks in no small part to one unforgettable moment when a beginner turned the tables on her instructor and changed the game for everyone involved. Months had passed since that unforgettable day in the dojo, and while life inside its walls had settled into a new rhythm, the impact of what happened continued to ripple outward. The woman at the center of it all still came to class regularly, her presence now commanding a quiet respect from everyone, students and instructors alike. She wasn't the loudest or flashiest person in the room, but there was an undeniable aura about her. It wasn't arrogance. It was confidence born not just from skill, but from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for. The instructor, too, had undergone a transformation not overnight, but gradually, like water smoothing rough stones over time. He no longer strutted around the dojo with his chest puffed out, barking orders or cracking jokes at others' expense. Instead, he moved with purpose, his focus shifting from showing off to truly teaching. His explanations became clearer, his corrections kinder, and his patience seemingly endless. Students noticed these changes, even if they didn't always say so aloud. There was a mutual understanding now, a silent acknowledgement that both teacher and student were on the same journey, learning and growing together. But perhaps the most profound change was how the dojo itself felt. What had once been a place where fear of failure hung heavy in the air was now a space filled with encouragement and camaraderie. Beginners weren't afraid to ask questions anymore, knowing they wouldn't be mocked for their lack of knowledge. Senior students took pride in mentoring newcomers, sharing tips and cheering them on during difficult drills. Even the youngest members of the class, the wide-eyed kids who sometimes struggled to tie their belts straight, seemed more eager to participate, their laughter mingling with the sounds of kicks and punches echoing through the room. For the woman, this shift meant more than just a better training environment. It validated everything she had worked toward since joining the dojo: respect, empowerment, and unity. Every time she saw someone step up to help another student or heard an instructor gently guide a beginner through a challenging move, she felt a swell of pride, not because she'd caused these changes, but because she'd played a part in sparking them. One evening, after a particularly grueling practice session, the instructor called everyone to gather in the center of the mat. This was unusual. Typically, classes ended with a quick bow and dismissal. But tonight, he stood quietly for a moment, scanning the faces of his students before speaking. "I want to say something," he began, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "A while back, I made a mistake, a big one. And you probably haven't forgotten it." He paused, glancing briefly at the woman standing near the edge of the group. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression neutral but attentive. "I let my ego get in the way," he continued. "I thought being tough and pushing people hard was the best way to teach. But I realize now that it's not about making people tougher, it's about helping them find strength within themselves. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, and I lost sight of that." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. No one moved, no one spoke. They simply listened as he opened up in a way none of them had ever seen before. "I'm working on doing better," he said finally, his tone softer. "And I hope you'll hold me accountable if I slip up again." When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, one by one, students began to nod. Some offered small smiles, while others gave him approving thumbs up. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Trust takes time to rebuild, but it was acceptance. And for the instructor, that was enough. Afterward, as the class dispersed and people headed home, the woman lingered behind to roll up her mat. She hadn't expected the instructor's speech, and though it didn't erase the past, it showed her that real growth was possible, even for someone set in their ways. As she tucked her gear into her bag, she noticed him walking toward her, hesitating slightly before stopping a few feet away. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I just wanted to say thanks for calling me out that day. I needed it." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We all need reminders sometimes," she replied, "even me." He smiled faintly, looking relieved, and after a brief exchange, they parted ways. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation or a Hollywood-style apology scene, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes, Progress comes in quiet moments like these, simple, honest, and human. As weeks turned into months, the dojo continued to thrive. New students joined, drawn by word-of-mouth stories of a welcoming and supportive community. The woman found herself mentoring several of them, patiently guiding them through techniques and offering advice when they doubted themselves. One evening, as she helped a shy teenager perfect a kick, she realized something. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a leader, a role model, and a source of inspiration for others. Her own journey wasn't without challenges, of course. There were days when fatigue crept in, when old insecurities resurfaced, or when life outside the dojo threatened to pull her down. But every time she stepped onto the mat, she remembered why she was there, not just to train her body, but to fortify her spirit. Martial arts had given her tools to face whatever came her way, whether it was a rude comment on the street or a daunting challenge at work. And each time she used those tools, she grew stronger, not just for herself, but for those watching. Her example. Looking back, she knew that standing up to the instructor had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the story. Life is full of moments like that, moments that test your courage, push you out of your comfort zone, and force you to decide who you want to be. For her, it had been a chance to reclaim her power and inspire others to do the same. And as she bowed alongside her fellow students at the close of another class, she felt grateful not just for the skills she'd learned, but for the connections she'd forged and the lives she'd touched along the way. In the end, the dojo wasn't just a place to practice martial arts. It was a reminder that strength isn't measured by belts or trophies, but by the ability to stand tall, speak up, and lift others as you rise. And for the woman who had once felt powerless, that realization was worth more than any title or accolade.